Hello, and welcome to our third installment of Ask a Chef. Today we're going to talk about recipes, and this is a series that is brought to you by Prairie Food Co-op and Culinary Confidante. Culinary Confidante is a business that I started in an effort to teach people how to cook healthy food that tastes good and make it fun. We do that through in-home coaching, cooking parties, and workshops in the community. And actually, I've done some of those workshops with Prairie Food Co-op, and it's been fun. Now that everybody's at home, we're taking that virtually and trying to answer questions that you might have during this time. A lot of us are in our kitchen more than normal, so if you have questions or anything like that, feel free to chime in. I love to get personal and answer questions. So the other thing, also Prairie Food Co-op, if you're not familiar with Prairie Food Co-op, they are a community-owned grocery store that is hoping to open in Lombard very soon. They will provide a marketplace for as much sustainably and locally produced produce as possible. So that will be really exciting when that happens. And so I have so many things to talk about today. There's a lot of recipes out there. Shaking this. Sorry, try not to shake it. And sometimes it can be intimidating. I know I've heard people say that watching all the cooking shows and the chefs and everybody knows how to do everything, and it can be intimidating. And so what I try to do is demystify some of that and make cooking something that anybody can do. If you've seen the kids movie Ratatouille, anyone can cook. That's one of my favorites. Because I really think that just about anybody can cook, just about anybody. And my goal is to try to, give people the skills to help them get where they want to be in the kitchen. So if you can see me, we had a little bit of difficulties. Comment and let me know you're here and watching. For some reason, my computer didn't want to start the auto live today. So, yes. Hello, thank you. Definitely been a learning experience for me. It's funny because I'm here to help people learn about the kitchen, and I clearly need help learning about IT stuff. So, yeah, feel free to let me know your secrets. Luckily, I have IT. So, thank you for sharing that link, Jerry. Hi, Steve. Okay, so let's, I'm going to go get started. Hopefully people were able to find our link. I have to just keep closing these pop-ups so that I can make sure that I see all of your comments. Because last time I wasn't able to see your comments because pop-ups got in the way. And yes, so okay, I'm going to dive right in. I have a lot of notes, and my plan is to not spill any water on my notes today like last time. If you got to see that, that was fun. So when you are looking at a recipe, there are some things that you're going to want to look for. The basic things are the ingredients. That's a no-brainer, but also the amounts. And then it should also tell you, like, if it's like vegetables, like how are you supposed to be using those vegetables? Is it carrots? Are they supposed to be peeled and cubed? Are they supposed to be tiny diced or whatever? So usually you'll find that in the top part of the recipe. And then you'll also want to make sure that you've got the info as far as oven temperature, how long does it take, and I definitely recommend reading through the whole recipe before starting, because if you get halfway and then it says chill overnight, but you're planning on eating it for dinner, you will be in trouble. So that's something that I have made the mistake of not doing, and I definitely want to encourage people to, getting shaky, kicking things, read your recipes all the way through. Some recipes will have serving or having nutrition information on it. That is not something that is necessary. It's interesting for some people if if you need to know calories or sodium amounts if you're on a specific diet, but it's not really a necessary thing in order for you to have a good recipe. And the way that that is typically calculated, nowadays there are all kinds of programs where you can just type in all the different ingredients. And if you find a recipe that doesn't have nutrition information for it, there are free things. You can just Google it, I'm sure, and you type in the amounts, you type in the ingredient, and then it'll add all that stuff up and it'll give you the information for all of that stuff. But again, unless you're on a special diet or something like that, you don't really need to have that information. So, and then again, instructions. This is a big one. If you are the type of person that looks for recipes online, you will probably notice that there are blogs all over the place, and they tell you everything that you might not want to know, nothing to do with the recipe. And then finally at the bottom, it'll be the recipe. I have some recipes on my website, not a lot because I typically encourage cooking without a recipe, but I do have some recipes on there. There is no life story on there. There's some nutrition facts or fun facts about food, and then, or skills or things like that. And then there's also just the recipe, like this much. That's all you really need. So skip, sometimes now they have a little button at the top of the blog and it'll say jump to recipe or skip to recipe. That's great. But you don't, yeah. You want to make sure that the instructions are easy to read, you understand what it is before you start doing it. And so those are just the basics. You want to know the ingredients, you want to know the amount of the ingredients, and then how you can prep it, because this will, if you read the ingredients, and then I have like a visual, this is my visual. You can prep all your stuff ahead of time, and that actually is a term it's a French term called mise en place, which is everything in its place. And so if you cut your onions, chop your garlic, cut all your vegetables, get it all ready ahead of time, then you can be like one of the people in the cooking shows and just throw it in when it's time. But really that will help the timing of things if it's something that you've made for the first time or you're making for the first time and you don't want to burn something. Like first step might be cook your onions, and then like one of the things that I noticed Rachel Ray did on her shows, I don't really watch it anymore, but she would cook as she would do the recipe. And honestly, that's how I do a lot of my cooking, but I've been doing it for a long time. So it's a time saver for me to dice my onions, cook them, and then dice other stuff while this is cooking. But don't do that if you're not confident that you can finish all that prep before the other steps are done. So yeah, that was kind of a tangent. Sorry about that. But anyway, so the basics, the ingredients, the serving size and the amount. Some on blogs, they don't always have these, but easy way to get that if you need it for something is you calculate the volume. So add up how much of all the ingredients are in your recipe and say gives you 12 cups. Well, do you want to have 6 servings out of this? If so, divide 12 cups by 6, and then you'll have 6 2-cup servings. That would be for like chili or a soup or something like that. And then you can adjust based on that. You want to have 2 servings that are 6 cups? You go backwards, do the other way. So yeah, that's something that I'm very familiar with because I do a lot of recipe writing for workshops and things like that. So as far as what to look for, I know this is something I browse recipes online, and I don't always use them or follow them, but I'll use them for inspiration. And so one of the things that I like to do, yes, clean as you go, not as you went. Yes, that is a good tip. You should clean up as you go. Thank you, Jerry. I have to make sure I keep scrolling down so I can see all these things. I forgot what I was talking about. Yes, so if you're looking for a recipe, a couple good ways for you to tell whether or not it's something that you actually want to spend your time making. Does it have all those basic things that we talked about? Does it have the ingredients? Does it have the amount of the ingredients? Does it have the prep of how you should prep it? Should it be chopped? Should it be peeled? Should it be rinsed? Or like rice, is it raw rice or is it cooked rice? You want to make sure that all of that makes sense. And then another big one is the source. Where is this recipe from? Is it from one of these websites that has a bazillion recipes? Who wrote this recipe? Do you know? Take that into consideration. Is it a recipe on a blog that you've made lots of things from before and they all turned out great? If so, then you're probably going to trust that recipe. Is it, I like New York Times recipes. I like Bon Appetit recipes. I like Food and Wine is another one of my favorites. And I do follow a plant-based diet. So a lot of the Food and Wine recipes or Bon Appetit recipes, they're not plant-based, but I substitute ingredients, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. But you can make any recipe and tailor it to what you want to make. Whether it's, you're not, you don't have all the ingredients. But you still want to make brownies, but you don't have butter or something like that. First of all, I don't really like going to the store. So it's kind of working out well for me now because I don't have to go to the store. Well, but anyway, I have experience substituting things because I like to use what I have on hand. So Savior and Martha Stewart recipes are also a favorite. I haven't tried the first. I'll have to look into that. If you have other recipe sources that are your favorites, feel free to shout them out or shout them with your fingers, and I will mention those for other people to check out as well. So back to where I was going with this, how to tell if you've got a good recipe. Ratings too, like, does it have any ratings? Do people like this recipe? If it has no ratings, you're not sure who wrote it, I don't know how much I would trust this recipe. But if it's a recipe that's got 4 or 5 stars, people commented, they said, I loved this, or I changed this, or whatever, read those. I'm not saying you have to read them all, but use that as something to consider when you're deciding whether or not you want to make this recipe. Another thing that I like to do actually is I will look at a couple different recipes for the same type of thing. Like, say I want to make super fudgy brownies. I'm talking about brownies again. I might look at 3 different recipes and see what those recipes have in common. If there's one recipe that seems totally different, I might not make that one because kind of like a multiple choice test, like which one doesn't fit. So then you can kind of choose, the better option from what you find. And it doesn't have to be hard. You don't have to, do all of this research. I'm just trying to provide some suggestions as far as what to look for when you are trying to find a recipe. Cooks Illustrated, another good source, yes. And America's Test Kitchen, yes. Oh, and that reminds me, Alton Brown is actually one of my favorites because he always explains the reason behind what you're doing. And I try to do that in a lot of my cooking as far as, do you know why we turned the oven to 450 instead of 250? Or do you know why you can use butter instead of oil, or why you can't use butter instead of oil? And like the science behind that kind of stuff. Because I think when you understand why things are happening with your food, it makes it makes it make more sense. And then you understand how to apply that when you're doing it again in something else, which goes back to me not necessarily teaching specific recipes. So yeah, I love algebra. Okay, so yes, you want to look for, does it have all the basics? What is the source? Does it have ratings? And then the ingredients too. Read the ingredients. I honestly, that's the first thing I will look at when I look at a recipe. What are the ingredients? Does this sound like things that go together well? Does it sound weird? Does it have crazy things that I would have to like drive to some random part of town to buy? If so, I'm probably not going to make that. Um, and does it like, do the ingredients remind you of something you've made before? Does it make sense? And maybe that's a skill that, comes with more practice or over time, but, pay attention to like your gut with that, because if it sounds weird, it might be weird. But there are also weird combinations that go well together. So you just got to try stuff sometimes. And if you like it, then it's good. So, as far as now, applying recipes to now, a lot of things have changed. It's not as easy to just run out and get one stick of butter, or, well, you can't. It's hard to buy one stick of butter by itself anyway, but just one ingredient is what I meant. And you're not going to want to go to the store as often, or maybe you're trying to make things on a budget, not spend as much money right now. Everyone has a different situation, and so whether you want to adjust your recipes, you can scale it up or scale it down. And that means, I talked a little bit about that before, but like say you're making a pot of chili. Maybe you want to make a pot of chili that is 4 times what you would normally make if you have a giant pot that would hold 4 times that much, but then you can freeze it. So in order to scale it, you would go back to basic math and just find a factor. So if you're wanting to make 4 times as much, multiply all of your ingredients by 4. And one of the things that helps with this is knowing the amount of measurements. And what I mean by that is knowing that there are 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon. There are 4 tablespoons in a quarter of a cup, and then 4 quarters of a cup in 1 cup. A pint is 2 cups. 4 cups in a quart. I'm quizzing myself now. 4 cups, 4 quarts in a gallon. A gallon is I learned this in culinary school, and I always remembered it this way. But a liter is a little bit more than a quart. It's a play on words there. A little bit more than a quart. And knowing those things will help you when you want to scale your recipes up or scaling it down if you're wanting to make like half as much of something. And so to scale it up, you would just multiply all of your ingredients by 4, but that gets tricky when you've got 3 teaspoons of something. So then are you going to take 3 teaspoons times 4, and then in your recipe, you're going to write 12 teaspoons, and then you're going to sit there and go 1, 2, 12 times? It would make more sense if you knew that 3 teaspoons, which that recipe actually should have just said 1 tablespoon, but 3 teaspoons is, I'm probably confusing everybody now, but bear with me. If you can convert it into the larger unit, it will make it easier when you are measuring. So if we had 3 teaspoons in 1 and we were making 4, then it would be 12 teaspoons. But actually, 12 teaspoons is 4 tablespoons. Yes, am I doing this correctly? 4 tablespoons is a quarter of a cup. So instead of measuring 12 teaspoons, you can just measure a quarter of a cup of something. And a nice thing to have, actually was going to show it, but forgot. I have a towel that has all the measurements of everything on it. Not that I need it, but I thought it was cute. And it's in my kitchen. It's a bread towel. And I've seen people have magnets that have all these things on them, and then they'll put that on the fridge. And it's a nice little cheat sheet, because you don't always need to know all these things by heart. I did, because I got tested on it back in the day. But it's helpful. It is helpful to know. And if you have it posted in your kitchen, then maybe you'll just learn it and you'll remember it all the time. So another thing with measurements is you probably have in your kitchen the scoop measuring cups, like the little circle ones that have a handle. And then you probably also have like a glass measuring cup or plastic or whatever that's got the numbers on it and the little pour spout. So the difference, if you don't know, is one of those is for dry ingredients and one of those is for wet ingredients. So sometimes on a recipe, you'll see it say not just 3 ounces, like 3 OZ, but it'll say 3 FL period OZ. So that's fluid ounces. And so that's a liquid measurement. And so for that, you would use your liquid measuring cup, and that's the one with the pour spout. The measurements are slightly different. So liquid is measuring volume, whereas the ounces and the just regular ounces is measuring weight. So for baking especially, it's great to use a scale actually instead of the scoops. And sometimes, I don't know, some recipes will say, like if you're measuring flour, the best way to do that is to use a spoon and to scoop. I had some flour here, that'd be perfect. We'll just pretend, scoop it and gently put it in there versus digging your measuring cup into the flour, because that's going to pack it down and you're going to have a different amount than if you had scooped it in. But if you weigh it, get a little kitchen scale, that is going to give you the perfect measurement every time. And that's how you can make things come out exactly the same every time. If you're making rolls or if you're making cookies, you can weigh it out. So each one is, 3 ounces or whatever it is you're making. And then they all come out the same and they all look beautiful. So that's a little bit about adjusting recipes. Does anyone have any questions about anything that I talked about? I have more to talk about, but I love to answer your questions. So I'll let you ask away if you do, and then I'll talk about substitutions. Do I take a drink from my Prairie Food cup? Not spilling today. All right. So substitutions. There's lots of different things you can substitute, and actually this is probably where people would have more questions. Like I said earlier, I follow a plant-based diet, and so I am constantly substituting things because I will look, like I love to look on Pinterest and find things that look yummy, and then I will use those for inspiration. I don't necessarily follow the recipe. Recipes feel very restricting for me. And I will say, if you're wanting to improvise, which I'll talk a little bit about in a couple minutes, do it with cooking versus baking, because baking is more of a science, and if you just throw in whatever you want, things may not go well. You need a certain amount of ingredients for it to rise or puff up or whatever's happening. It's more like chemistry and science when you're baking versus when you're cooking. There is definitely some of that involved, but there's more room for adjusting and playing around and seasoning as you go. It's a little bit different. You don't really taste your batter and then bake it, and then you can't really go back and fix it. That's the other thing with baking. So if you're wanting to improvise, I would start with cooking before you improvise with baking, because you have to do a lot of trial and error with that. So yes. So we talked about volume and weight and all that. And so when you are substituting something, you want to make sure that you're substituting the same amount. So you might be substituting a different ingredient, but you want to end up with the same amount volume-wise. So typically, not always, there's always an exception to the rule. But so milk is one that I commonly am substituting. There's all kinds of substitutions. You can, I choose to substitute with non-dairy, whether it's almond milk or soy milk or oat milk or any of the other non-dairy milks. There's so many options. But one thing I will say is if you are substituting with non-dairy milk, um, don't use something that's sweet in a savory recipe. Like if you're making macaroni and cheese, for an easy example, I mean, I think everyone knows how to make macaroni and cheese. And I'm talking about from the box. I do a really good homemade macaroni and cheese recipe, but you add butter and you add milk. Well, if you add sweetened soy milk to macaroni and cheese, not going to taste good. In that case, I would either use water or I would use a vegetable broth, something that's got a savory flavor to it. And yes, so that is definitely a tip. I've made that mistake once. And as far as substituting dairy, there's a lot of different types as far as the fat amount. So if you have heavy cream or whipping cream, that's going to have a higher fat content. I am answering your question before you even ask it, Jerry. If you have a higher fat content, you're going to want to make sure that you add fat into whatever you're substituting. So if you're substituting heavy cream, you could use milk, and I would use milk with as much fat as possible, so a whole milk, and then you could also add butter to that to make up for the fat that you're missing out. You could also, if you're wanting to do a non-dairy option, you could do soy milk and silken tofu. And the difference between tofus is silken is creamier, whereas like a firm or extra firm is like chunky, and you wouldn't want to do that. I actually use silken tofu in a cheese sauce recipe that's non-dairy, and that comes out great. You could also use half and half in butter. You could use Greek yogurt and milk. Lots of different options. And one thing to keep in mind is the term mouthfeel. So when you have fat in a dish, it kind of coats the inside of your mouth and gives it that like creamy sensation. So if you are substituting something that has a lot of fat, you're going to want to substitute fat back into that, if that makes sense. So you wouldn't necessarily want to substitute skim milk for heavy cream. You could, but it's not going to give you that same creaminess in your mouth as the heavy cream would. Egg is another one. My personal favorite substitute for egg is flax. Flax is super healthy for a number of reasons. Won't go into all of that because that's a whole other tangent that we could talk about for way more time than I have. But to make a flax egg, you just do 1 tablespoon of flax, ground flax, and 3 tablespoons of water. An easy way that I remember that is the volume of an egg is 1/4 cup. And so 4 tablespoons is 1/4 cup. This is where that comes in handy that we talked about before. So you have 1 tablespoon of flax, 3 tablespoons of water, and you have your 1/4 cup, which would be the same volume as 1/4 cup, which is 1 egg. And the flax, if you let it sit for a couple minutes, it'll kind of like get it'll gelatinize and get kind of gummy, and that is what you're using as your binder. And I use that in anything that I would use for eggs, not scrambled eggs. I mean, that'd be weird. But in like breading, 3-step breading process, so you can dredge it in flour. Normally you would coat it, whatever it is, in egg, then you're breading. Use a flax egg, season each of your steps. It works out just exactly the same way. In baking, I've done it. I made hamburger buns. They came out great the other day. Yeah, that's been my favorite. You can also, in baking, you can use applesauce. You could use ripe mashed bananas. They make egg substitutes nowadays. There's a brand called Just Egg. And that's great. You can cook that up like scrambled eggs, and it's very similar. It's made from mung beans, actually, which is pretty cool. Uh, Full fat coconut milk. We want to substitute. Oh, you're answering his question. Oh, I love that. Okay, that's a good thing I didn't mention that. Yes, you can substitute full fat coconut milk for heavy cream. Um, it will give it a coconut flavor, but depending on what you're making, that could be delicious. Um, and same goes for substitute. That'll take me into my next one, oils. You can use coconut oil in place of olive oil or other oils. But again, depending on what oil you're using, it will impart a flavor to it. So if you're making something where you don't mind it tasting like coconut oil, great. If you're making a curry or baked goods or something where that's, fine, then great. I actually like to make popcorn with um, coconut oil. I think it's delicious. If you know me, I talk a lot about popcorn. I know it's not very gourmet, but we make it gourmet in my house. What else do I have on my list here? Buttermilk. Buttermilk is an easy substitute. You just add a little bit of an acid to whatever milk you're using. So, like, you could do almond milk with apple cider vinegar or lemon juice, and you just let it sit for a little bit. And the non-dairy milks don't really curdle as much as traditional dairy would, but it's still, the vinegar gives it that tanginess. So that's a good substitute. Uh, what else? Gluten-free. There's so many gluten-free options. I do not really cook gluten-free. I love gluten, but I've experimented with it plenty. And you can use oat flour, you can use rice, buckwheat, millet, coconut, and sometimes it's better to use a blend of those because the texture is going to come out different. And it depends on what you're making. There's a lot of gluten-free mixes out there that are all ready to go. And I mean, just go with one of those if you want, I don't know. Not a huge gluten-free person, but I know there's allergies, and so there's lots of options nowadays. And yes, I also love gluten, Jerry. um, okay, so another substitution, which may be helpful for now, is when you are, I'm going to take a drink really quick. When you're using produce, the recipes may call for fresh or frozen or canned. Depending on what it is, will depend on what you may or may not want to substitute. But as far as fresh versus frozen versus canned, fresh is generally best and usually my first choice. However, there are some really good frozen substitutes, and frozen stuff is actually really great as far as the process. It's typically frozen right at the peak of its freshness, so it's got the same nutrient density. And if you are the type of person that things kind of go to die in your produce drawer, I know there's plenty of people that maybe overbuy or things like that. Having frozen, sorry, is always a great option because it's not going to go bad. It's going to live in your freezer for a long time. And so as far as frozen options, I always try to have broccoli and blueberries and frozen spinach or frozen kale. Actually started buying too. Those are all great options. Edamame is a good one. You can just stick that in the microwave or double boiler, steamer, whatever. And canned is good for canned tomatoes and beans. Those are great canned options to have on hand regularly. But you're going to want to make sure, like with your beans, that you rinse them, and with any canned vegetables, really. Although with diced tomatoes, you're usually using the juice, so you probably don't want to rinse those. And sodium is typically higher in canned stuff, if that's a concern for you. But I know you can buy low sodium stuff now too. So, and also we have to talk about meat substitutions because I don't eat meat, so I always have to mention that. One of the easiest ways to substitute meat is beans. There are so many types of beans, and it's super easy and it's cheap. Chickpeas are great. Lentils also very healthy, and there's so many things you can do with them. You can season them, however, like to taste like whatever you want. The other day I made sloppy joes with lentils, and then I made a purple cabbage coleslaw to go on top of that. So you had your and I made a sauce for the sloppy joes. So it was, sloppy. It came out the sides and it was delicious. You can do tacos with beans. You can, so many things. Wraps, throw them on salads. And then another fun one is it's called TVP, which stands for texturized vegetable protein. And it's it's like a dried soy crumbly thing. It's dehydrated and it's like little cardboard pieces, but I like to use that in chili, and it mimics ground beef. I've had a lot of people tell me they thought it was ground beef because it just absorbs whatever seasoning you put into it, and super simple. You don't have to brown it like ground beef. You just make your chili, you throw it in there, and that's it. As far as what are we talking about? We're talking about substitutions. It'd be easier if I could see you guys, and then I could know what you would like me to talk about. Let me know if there's something I haven't touched on that you want to know about substituting, or anything really kitchen related. I have two more substitutions. Vinegars, you can use them pretty interchangeably as far as the light vinegars versus the dark vinegars. Usually you would use certain types of vinegars for certain things, but they're all pretty interchangeable, other than like balsamic has a different flavor than like a rice vinegar, or there's apple cider vinegar, but you can use vinegars and you can use acids interchangeably in a lot of things. There's a series and a book. I don't remember what order it's at. Heat, salt, acid, fat, something like that. And she talks about the key components of cooking. And so if you're thinking about, like, what am I substituting? Am I substituting the acid? Okay, well, put a different acid in. You don't have lemons? Do you have limes? Would that taste okay? You don't want the lime flavor? Use apple cider vinegar. Don't have apple cider vinegar? Use white vinegar. That doesn't really taste like much. Don't have white vinegar? Do you have rice vinegar? Do you have champagne vinegar? Do you have, I don't know. There's a lot of options there. So, and then as far as heat, there's cayenne pepper, which there's also red pepper flakes. So the difference between red pepper flakes and cayenne pepper is one type of pepper, whereas the red pepper flakes typically is a couple different types of peppers, and also you'll see the seeds in there too, and there's bigger pieces. So they're a little bit different, but they both give heat to your dish. You could also use different hot sauces. There's so many hot sauces, and if you look at the ingredients, they have different types of chilies usually. Like Thai food will have one type of chili, Mexican food will have a different type. They'll have different flavors, and that's how I decide what type of hot sauce to use actually when I am putting hot sauce on my food, because I do that very often. Um, I'll use Cholula, or I have a couple different jalapeno or habanero hot sauces if I'm having like Mexican food or something. And then I have sriracha, which I'll use if I'm having Asian food, because it'll pair well with that. And then lastly, I was going to touch on if you want to improv. One of the easiest things to do is use something that you know, something that you're comfortable with, that you are familiar, you've cooked it before, and change one or two things about it, and then see how that goes. If you, I talked already about you want to cook as opposed to bake when you're improving, because baking is more of a science. You've got your leavening and your binders and things like that. So one of the things that I like to teach people how to improv on is soup. Soup is very forgiving. You can throw just about anything in there and you taste it and you can adjust it and you can taste it and you can adjust it. And you want to make sure that you're adding the right amount of heat and salt and fat and acid. And when you're tasting, think about those things. Does it have the right amount of each of these? If not, add a little bit more. And again, always add a little bit and taste it. Then go back. You can always add more, but you can't take it out. So another way to improv would be start with like a base recipe. So maybe you like to make pasta. Easy way to do it, pick a pasta shape, pick a type of sauce, then pick what you want to throw in there. Do you want to roast veggies? Pick a vegetable. So like maybe I roasted broccoli the other day and threw it with some sauce that I had, and I forget what the shape of the pasta was, but that's one of my new favorite things to do is roast broccoli and throw it with pasta. Bulk up your pasta with vegetables. And then also I'm a big fan of doing Buddha bowls. So with that, you have somebody coming to visit me. Maybe he'll come over here. You have you choose a grain for the bottom, and then you choose a vegetable, and then this is my cat, and his name is Mirepoix. Actually, that's also a great thing to learn. Mirepoix is carrots and celery and onions and Buddha bowls. Okay, so you have your grain, your vegetable, a protein, a sauce, and then some toppings. Choose whatever you want. Choose whatever things that you think would go together well, and go from there. It's easy to improv. You just have to get started. And here we go. Say hello. He's like, nope, I'm not gonna be on camera. Okay, so yeah, and then also I talked briefly about the importance of knowing why you're doing things. The more you know about why you are doing things, the more you will be able to improv. Do you know why you cooked it at 450? Do you know why you want to cut it into large pieces versus small pieces? Well, I'll tell you, small pieces are going to cook faster, large pieces are going to cook slower. So if you had, same goes for temperature, like if you think of brisket or something like a big piece of meat, I don't eat that, but it's a good example. And you cook low and slow, biting my computer. Get out of here. You want to cook something low and slow, that's low temperature for a long amount of time. And with that, you would use large chunks of something like big pieces of carrots, big pieces of onion. And then if you're making something like a stir fry, you're going to cook it on a high heat for a short amount of time, and you're going to cut the pieces really small. So understanding that helps you improv. So as far as roasting, you want things to be he's relentless. You want things to be high temperature, short amount of time. That's why if you're making pizza, you want to cook it like 450 or higher. If you have a pizza oven, great. But if you made your pizza at like 300, it would come out mushy. And you don't want that. So I covered all of the things that I wanted to talk about. Plus, we got a visit from Mirepoix, which was unexpected. I don't know why he's coming up here. So I am I'm having so much fun doing these, and I love answering your questions and seeing everybody watch and tune in. This has been a great time for me and for Mirepoix. And yeah, so if you have any other questions, feel free to contact me. And I am offering video chat, like video coaching, because obviously I'm not going to come to your kitchen, unfortunately, right now. And yeah, so we're taking things virtual. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out via Facebook or my website, culinaryconfidant.com. And if you have any questions about Prairie Food Co-op, also feel free to ask me. I know lots about them too. I've been working with them and it's been super fun. I am very excited for when they open and can't wait to do, lots more fun work with them. So hopefully you can get outside, enjoy this beautiful weather today, and that's what I'm going to do. So thanks again for tuning in, and take care.